Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the 36th Sustainable Agriculture Conference. You've joined Organic Mulches on Small Scale Farms, presented by Nathan Wheeler of RavenRidge Family Farms. My name is Mariana Spence, and I'm the membership coordinator here at CFSA, and I'll be your workshop host for today. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and put your questions in there throughout the presentation. Nathan will be answering them as we have time throughout the presentation and at the end. Please keep in mind our community agreements as you engage in chat here and throughout the conference. And we'd like to thank our session sponsor, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Please check them out in our trade show for more information. And now I will hand it over to Nathan.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation and the beautiful picture of fall foliage that I took that this morning on my morning rounds. It's definitely beautiful out. Hope everybody has a chance to enjoy it some later today. Don't go now. So today we're going to be focusing on at small farm scale. And my goal here, is to try and provide you enough information that you can sort of understand how a mulching strategy might work for your particular operation, and also actually feel confident that you could implement it at least starting on a small scale, as soon as next season. So just a little quick intro to me here. I'm regenerative land manager now, haven't always been. I grow hemp now. In the last few years, I've been doing that on my parents' farm, and also am a multi-species grazer. We do mixed small species adaptive grazing across our two farms, and are trying to learn how to do that sustainably on a limited space of land. Spend as much time as possible outside of nature, and am a husband and father. Those two probably should have been first. Would love to know a little bit more about who some of you all are. I know some folks who are here, but I kind of am a little bit new to this whole community. So if you want to throw some things there in the chat real quick, I'll catch up on it at the first break here in the presentation. I did want to give you a little bit more context about who I am, because the way that I've approached things on our farm is, maybe going to be a little different in some ways than what you've seen, and I think it's worth y'all having some sense of why that is. Quite a few years ago, I'm older than I look, despite the gray. I'm also younger than I look in some ways. So I studied avian and plant biology at UNC, and then sort of got sucked into web development world for a while, working for companies that were doing biochemistry and biology supplemental content on the web back in the early days when most folks weren't, so used to doing work on the web as they are today. And then eventually I headed out of that whole arena, left Austin, where I had spent a few years, and came back home to North Carolina. Went to herbal medicine school, did some PDC, permaculture design coursework, and then started spending some time on the farm, really trying to do something meaningful on the land and feel some connection again to a land base, or really a connection for the first time where I was really aware of it as a connection I was looking for. So today, I'm farm manager at RavenRidge Family Farm, which is my parents' farm in Pilot Mountain, North Carolina. And we grow hemp and make farm-made products. We harvest and extract on the farm, except for one step that's cost prohibitive. And then, combine the oil from our flower into products that we sell on our website. And we also grow elderberry and calendula and other things within the context of the hemp farm and the bigger property, and then run all the animals that I had mentioned before through the property, mostly for our own food and for the benefits they provide. And then at home, I sort of help my wife manage Hidden Springs Farm, which is in King, North Carolina. And there we really breed locally adapted herbivores, goats and cows. We run hogs occasionally as we need them, but we don't run them as often as the other animals. And then we do small scale soap with the things that we grow and raise, and elderberry syrup and things like that. And then I stay quite busy with this cute little booger down here on the right, our 3-year-old, recently 3-year-old little Willie. It was a handful. So that was the introductions, and I ran over on a minute, but I guess I like to talk about myself more than I realized. The rest of the time, I really hope to get into mulching and the details of mulching, but I do feel like we need to start with just a quick primer on regenerative agriculture from the RavenRidge perspective, just so that you again have a sense of why we have developed the mulching program that we've developed. Whether that's the same program that you all adopt or not. And then as we get a little further, we'll talk about specific mulching materials, and then we'll talk about some tips and tricks to scale this up from maybe your backyard garden or small homesteading plot to something that could potentially provide revenue or at least grow significantly more foods and fibers and materials than what you might already be familiar with doing using mulch. And then I think that we'll probably have some more questions, and that can go on later as needed. So I'd say let's dive right in. So regenerative agriculture, the way that we practice it is really just the intentional prioritization of soil health in the long-term management decisions that you make for ecological production systems, for growing systems. And I know there's some words here that probably, it could be simplified, but the reality is that if you're doing regenerative agriculture, you're really growing ecosystems. You're paying attention to ecology, not, this plant or that plant. You're paying attention to plant and insect interactions, not just is this insect. And so things suddenly, or quickly become really complex. For me, coming into this, it was really overwhelming to try and think about all of the individual problems that exist in converting land from degraded state to really healthy, fertile, living soil. And this definition of regenerative agriculture, where you really intentionally focus on how whatever your management decisions are going to impact your soil, and just specifically the health of the soil in the space that you're about to impact. That has been really helpful in focusing our efforts as we've worked on our farm, which we inherited as a degraded tobacco and hay farm. So just really quickly, the things that have really helped me in the process of learning how to think about and grow regeneratively. These kind of three interrelated sets of things have been things that have helped me as I've paid attention to natural systems. Number one, really paying attention to these system dependencies that exist wherever you are, and they're always unique and always specific to the place that you are. And dependencies are things that your system will not work without. And there are plenty of those in natural systems, and usually lots more in the growing systems that humans have developed. Think about the dependencies in a large field that you can only manage the way you manage with a tractor. Right there, the dependencies are huge. In natural systems, there are dependencies too, and it's really worth understanding what those are and how you can impact them, so you can plan and mitigate for risks. The second thing is really growing conditions, and specifically just what are the conditions in the space or spaces that you're going to manage. And as you start paying closer and closer attention to your land and the edges and the forests around and everywhere else, you'll find that there are dozens of growing conditions across a single field, particularly if it's a field that's been managed following regenerative practices. And that's a good thing. But if you don't know what those growing conditions are and what might thrive in those conditions, you're often going to be fighting an uphill battle in recovering land. And then the third thing is really diversity and abundance. I've found that the more we think about different kinds of diversity and diversities of diversities, the more we see the abundances that already exist in our natural systems that we've just been overlooking as humans, in lieu of these incredible plants that we have manipulated into existence, which are incredible and benefit us greatly. But we sort of see those, and we miss the whole forest that's out there for us to enjoy. So again, just really quickly, kind of the practice of regenerative agriculture. All of this is great, but how do you really do it? And for us, it's come down to a couple things. Number one, really, you have to be rooted in a connection to the land. And for me, I kind of thought, well, I go out on a hike, I walk my fields and I work the soil, so that's a connection. But the more time we put into doing this work, and the more time I spent doing things with the tractor, whether it was bush hogging or digging holes or whatever, the more I realized that I was still really disconnected. Each time I dug a hole with a tractor, when I would get off the tractor and look at the soil that I had disturbed, I would realize how much damage I'd done. Being very cognizant of the damage while riding the tractor. I sort of discovered that it doesn't really matter what you're thinking about when you're on a tractor. You're still on a tractor. So for me, it became a matter of figuring out how I can get my feet on the ground, my hands in the dirt as often as possible, and still manage this land with, the labor of myself, my wife, who was pregnant when we got started and has been, caring largely for our children and our home farm, and then my mom and dad, who are getting older, but man, work their butts off. The rest beyond that, it really comes down to keeping the soil covered with a living mulch when possible, once living mulch when not. And that's what we're going to get into here in just a second. Manage for ecosystem services as you're out there doing the work. Think about all the critters. Your decisions need to really make good sense for your soil health, but you do have to consider how your decisions are going to impact all the other critters, plants, trees, insects, everything, to the extent that you can practically do that. And then encourage diversity above and below ground, by disturbing as little as possible, and then by, seeding in diversity, literally with seeds and with whatever other actions you can take across your property. All right, so with that kind of hopefully basic sort of underpinning of why we've been doing what we do at RavenRidge for the last 5-10 years at different scales, let's talk about mulch. So conventionally, mulch is going to be kind of seen as anything that's used to cover ground, whether it's to protect it or to keep, reduce weedy competition or whatever the reason. And I like to group mulches into inorganic and organic mulches right out of the gate. The inorganics are going to be these things that don't biodegrade within a few seasons, whether that's your plastic mulches or whether it's going to be landscape fabrics or, or other things I've seen used, all kinds of stuff that you can use that won't really degrade. And that has its place, I'd say, but that's not really going to be the focus of this conversation. So the rest of the mulching materials are going to be these organic materials, which I like to break down a little bit further into your non-living organic materials. So stuff that was alive, but now necessarily alive, or at least has been, transmuted in its form in some way, compared to something that is actively alive and actively, growing and doing things on its own. So a little bit more regenerative definition of mulch then. could be any material that covers the ground in a manner that improves the conditions for life, both above and below the soil horizon. So properly applied mulches, are going to achieve this goal by being put down in a way and using materials in such a way that your temperature fluctuations in your soil and in the air, more in the air above the soil, don't impact the soil surface so much just by providing this sort of blanket of material, actually physically shielding the soil surface. It's shocking how much just a couple hard rains can compact soil that doesn't have anything covering it. And I just didn't really realize that, but man, just rain, or footfalls, your horses trample across something, or your deer or your people trample across something that doesn't have any thatch on top of it, no mulch or anything. That's going to be very different than if you do have mulch. Helps maintain soil moisture and reduces unwanted plant competition. All of these things are the sort of traditional benefits of mulches. So for those who haven't heard this kind of term, living organic mulches, what I mean by that is consists of two different kinds that we use. The first consists of living plants, that are either planted densely around your target species, or some of these sprawling plants with big leaves. A lot of your different gourds and squashes, folks like to use and have been traditionally used as this sort of living mulch. Bioaccumulators, often can make a lot of sense as a living mulch because they're going to pull us through their interactions in the soil that your target species might not. And I put whatever here because there's just so many ways that you can do this as you really start diving into it. And I know there's some smart alecks out there who are thinking, how's that different from a cover crop? And that's a very reasonable question. And I'll do my best to tell you how it's different. So cover crops typically are going to be terminated before or shortly after you plant your target crop, depending on what you're doing. Living mulches, the way that I use them anyway, they're going to be planted shortly before, right at the same time as, or shortly after you've planted your target crop, and are going to be left for the duration, usually for the duration of the time that your primary crops are growing. And then, also cover crops are really intended to sort of bring nutrients or cycle or use nutrients, whatever, cycle the nutrients in the system so that the next thing in the planting succession has more of what it needs. These living mulches, I feel like, kind of do that same thing because they do bring up these other mineral availabilities and potentially help with moisture depending on the plants. But they also bring this whole set of other ecosystem benefits that you don't have with cover crops, because the cover crops are terminated and no longer there for the majority of the time that your primary crop is growing. So I really like this idea of planting these living mulches and getting all the insects coming in and getting all the grazers coming in, and getting all these other inputs in your ecosystem as it's growing. So the picture here is this is one of the little raised beds for our home production outside of my parents' house at RavenRidge. And it's just, garlic that was planted in the fall. The picture's in spring, but the garlic had overwintered and grown some. And then this cover crop, it was, I think probably frost seeded in that year. But either way, some of that stuff just came up and left from what we had growing previously, like the, what is that, hen bit there? And then, there's vetch and clover and other things as well. And this garlic was great. We harvested it last fall, and it grew well. So the other kind of sort of living mulch that we use, it consists of fungi. And here we're either using inoculated mulch, so actually getting, fungal spores, or getting, I've lost the word for it now. Anyway, fruiting spawn and spreading it out into the mulch before we spread it or as we spread the mulch, the hardwood mulches. The other way we've done this is using spent mushroom substrate, where you actually, there's some pictures of that later so you can see more of that, but where you actually take mushroom blocks, fruiting blocks that have already fruited, and most of the organic material that the mushroom species can eat in that fruiting block has been consumed. And what's left is these fungi, mycelium, and really hard to digest stuff. But you can bust that apart into mulch, and that stuff is inoculant. It'll start growing. And you can see in the picture on the bottom here, my son Willie, in our little backyard plot, we used substrate blocks there, and you can see to the far right there, those are oyster mushrooms popping out of there. There's some pinks and some regular just gray oysters. And we also grew food in the front of that plot right there at the same time, which is really cool. In both of these cases, either way, you can get secondary or even secondary and tertiary or even more yields out of these kinds of systems. So really quickly, sort of, why might you choose to use organic mulches or living mulches? Any mulch you use, including, a lot of inorganic mulches, are going to reduce labor in your maintenance over the season. You're going to have an upfront bolus of labor, but then the rest of the year, if you've done your job well, you'll have less labor than you would have without the mulch. They're also going to help with water retention, moisture management, although I will say that under some of these sheet mulches, including really poorly laid down hay, you can get some anaerobic conditions just from the way that they hold moisture so well. So do be aware of that as a potential risk. So when you start using just organic mulches of various kinds, you're going to also be feeding the soil microbiome. You're going to be sheltering the soil and surface macrobiomes, so insects and micro and macro invertebrates and all kinds of critters are going to be able to live in that space. Eventually, those mulches become food for your plants themselves. They break down into plant available nutrition over time. And they can do that over multiple seasons. So using these organic mulches can improve your soil growing conditions even multiple seasons later. But only if you start using living mulches, which are, again, plants or fungi that are growing and thriving at the same time as your production crops. Only doing that can you actively improve soil health just from using the mulch. And you can do this by perpetuating that carbon sequestration machine that we've started to learn so much about lately. Where these plants are pumping sugars down out of their roots into the rhizosphere, which is then being, engaged with, and all these interactions begin to happen with the microbiology in the soil. And suddenly, lots of carbon, in fact, mostly in the form of dead bodies and live bodies of microbiology, is being sequestered down under the ground. And this can actively help mitigate the impacts of climate change. And to me, that's like, that's a pretty cool side benefit of doing something that creates healthier soil and better ecosystems anyway. So before we dig into the details of different kinds of mulches, how might you be able to know if your mulches are actually working? As you apply these things down, how do you know that they're doing the job they need to do, apart from fewer, weedy species, if that's one of your goals, or, more moisture being held in the soil? Well, if you recall, these organic mulches really, the biggest benefit they bring is creating conditions for living systems to emerge. And the way to know if these living systems are emerging with your mulches is to start by looking underneath the mulch after it's been down for a while. Look after a week, look after a month, look every day, whatever you can do, and start to observe, is there moisture under this mulch at the interface between the mulch and the soil? Is there any insect activity, or do you see ants? Do you see any movement at all? Start doing those observations, and you'll start to see if the mulches you're putting down are doing what they need to be doing. Also try and kind of pay attention to the overall diversity of all the other biomes around where you're growing, just because a lot of times you'll see other signs that the mulches that you're using or the management decisions you're making are positively impacting the bigger system, even if you don't see that right away under the soil. You may see birds that you haven't seen before. You may start to notice that there's a lot of grasshoppers. And these are really interesting and useful signs that your mulches, or again, whatever management decisions you're making, are having a positive impact. And then the last thing that you can really, do, it's not the last thing, but another thing that you can really do if you really want to dig into these is to do direct soil microbial counts, actually using a microscope, and actually start to track the trends of your soil biology over time in spaces that you're mulching and that you're not mulching. And this is the kind of work that we're really excited about doing at RavenRidge over the next few years. And some of the soil microbial analysis is something that we hope to be able to offer to the community, hopefully towards the end of next year. So feel free to email us about that, just if it's anything that might interest you, and we'd love to talk more. All right, so that was kind of a quick run through regenerative ag and mulching in context there. Thought it'd be useful to just take a minute. I'll scan through the chat and see if there's anything that has come up. Any questions? Doesn't look like yet. So maybe just have a sip of water and stretch our stretch our necks, and then we'll dive into the RavenRidge mulching strategy specifically, and the specific materials that we've used. All right. Well, I don't know if anybody was looking at the species there are here, and to be honest, I haven't done the full count, but I know that there's at least 12 that I can see and identify. Just looking at the picture, I have a sense, recalling the space, that there's quite a few more. Anyway. All right, so the RavenRidge mulching strategy. My goal early on with this whole farm and sort of what the promise I made to myself as I decided to get into farming on my parents' land was that I was going to figure out how to do this sustainably. That's what I was going to do. And at the time I didn't even know that was grow hemp. But I knew I was going to do it sustainably. And part of what that meant was finding local waste stream materials that, apart from stuff we could get off our own land, using local waste stream or, organic materials to build soil health. And because it was going to be pretty much just me working with, my mom as the main person helping, that this needed to be, a physically manageable job, since we're talking about of growing row that we maintain across an 1.5 acres of land. It also needed to be fiscally manageable because, the farm is currently funded by other jobs. My dad has full-time work that pays for what we do, but that can't be the long-term solution, because obviously that in itself is not sustainable. And then third, I really wanted, and this kind of evolved as we started to learn more, but I really wanted to use these different mulching materials that we eventually found gained access to, mix and match them in different ways so that we could create soil conditions that were really ideal for the target that we were growing in these different spaces. So that became hemp, and also, some trees in orchard type setting. But I really wanted to figure out how these different materials could be combined in ways that really benefited the microbiology that supported the plants we wanted to grow. So as we get access to different materials, there's lots of things that we have to consider. I'm particularly including this because, I think for a lot of the small farmers, small family farms, including us, a lot of times you just have to use whatever material you can get. It's not like, oh, I can drop $600 on, 4 loads of mulch, the first, when I don't even have a crop yet. So a lot of times, you get what you can get. So when you get what you can get, you get what you get. So you really need to pay attention to what's in that. What kind of microbiology and macrobiology is this material going to support? What kind of food is it? Is it food? Is it chemically or biologically contaminated, right? In which case it's not food for anything that you want to grow. So you're going to have to, mitigate that before you use it. If you're just getting sawdust, you might need to mix that with something else, because in a lot of cases, just applying sawdust is going to not have a net positive impact on your plant growth, whether it improves the soil health or not. So these questions are just the kinds of questions that you want to start asking yourself when you're looking at bills that you see in your community or that you bring onto your land or whatever. And then you start thinking about the spaces that you're going to be mulching and what to be in those spaces. And just this kind of reminder that really organic mulches should be sheltering the soil and surface macrobiomes. They should be feeding the microbiome under the soil so that this living system can emerge in your growing space, or can just be perpetuated if you already have living systems in your growing space. You might want to ask questions like, what growing conditions do my next season's plants like here? What am I putting in here, and how does it compare to what was here before? How long is this whatever material I'm putting down in this space going to last? And that question, has answers that vary from, not very long, because this is a really moist and damp environment. So, the cardboard I thought I might use is going to break down really fast. Or this is a super dry spot, and if I plop cardboard down up here, it's probably going to be there for a couple of years. And I've seen both those things work. So it's just something to pay attention to. Certainly paying attention to the condition of the ground that you're covering. Is it already bare soil? Is it really red and compacted? Is it, sand? All right, so let's run through some of the different materials that you can use in mulching. And we'll get started with hay. So for anybody who doesn't know, hay is pasture grass that has been cut green and allowed to dry in the field. And depending on, weather conditions that year and your farmer and so on and so forth, hay can come in a lot of different conditions. It's really versatile in that you can, roll it out from a round bale over a long space, flake it out pretty easily. You can usually move it to the side if you need to do something underneath a space. It's a pretty easy material to use in general, I would say. It confers really good soil protection, I found. If you lay it super duper thin, it's not going to do a whole lot from that perspective. But if you put it down, even just as a reasonably thick layer to where you don't really see any soil visible through it, it's going to provide really good protection for the soil from rain, from footfall. And it does a pretty good job of resisting growth if you plant it if you roll it out really thick and lay it really thick. On the downside, these round bales, of course, are really heavy, can be hard to deal with, particularly if you don't have a tractor. That can be a challenge. But square bales are more manageable in that situation. There is also this problem with, whatever goes onto the hayfield, certainly in the season prior to it being cut and baled, whatever goes on there is going to end up in the bale. Potentially, I know that there are plenty of instances of folks getting, pesticides and herbicides residues in their hay that they've used in their garden spaces and seeing setbacks for a year or two. So it is worth knowing, what, at least having some sense of what the practices are of the person you're purchasing hay from. And then I didn't put this here, but the other tough thing about hay is allergies, and it can get really bad. So that's just, I wish I had a magic way to deal with that one, but I don't. As far as getting hay mulches out, the round bales, like I said, are pretty heavy. Can weigh 350 up to 600 pounds. There are even bigger bales that I don't use that are even quite a bit heavier than that. So we use either tractor, truck, UTV, something like that, to get the bales to where they need to be, and then set them down at the heads of the rows. Unroll them by hand. Just cut the strings and push them, along a row. Or we have built a little round bale unroller, which is pretty simple. We'll look at that in a little more detail a little further on, but you can also, so you can use a machined, engined machine to pull the hay along if you need to. To be honest, we did that the first year, and since then we've pretty much always just pushed them by hand, because we've gotten better at managing them along the rows. And then square bales, we usually unload them into stacks off of a trailer, and then you can carry them out and set them down every 10 to 20 feet, cut the strings, and they have kind of flakes that come apart, 10, 15 flakes per bale, maybe fewer. And you just distribute those flakes and then fluff it all out, ideally using gloves and probably wearing a mask and glasses and every other kind of protection you can think of. So as far as coverage with hay, of course, it's going to vary depending on how you lay out the hay and even how the person who cut and baled the hay baled it. But generally speaking, if you're going to try to suppress growth with the hay, you're intending to get some maintenance reduction benefits from using it, you're going to have to lay it down pretty thick. On the other hand, if you're going to use a living mulch or you're covering bare soil that you had to disturb, pretty thin hay that your seed is going to be able to germinate up through is going to make a lot more sense. But generally speaking, a 4x4 round bale, a typical size round bale you're going to see around here, is going to cover about 500 square feet at a reasonable thickness to provide you some value. And a square bale is going to cover about 50 square feet. So it's about a 10-to-1 ratio is what they say between square bales and round bales. What about wood mulches? So there's several kinds of wood mulches that we use. Wood, can be chosen blades. It can be ground and kind of smashed and macerated like they do with the hardwood mulches. And it can come in really dry forms that where the wood is already dried all the way down to where there's not really hardly any moisture left. And that's usually like if you're recovering wood from or waste materials from a sawmill, cabinet shop, or something like that. And these all have their benefits. So, specifically, we use this ramial wood or chipped green wood quite a bit, and that's the stuff that you can sometimes get for free from your, utility service folks who are going down the road, cleaning up utility lines, chipping the small branches and leaves into the back of their trucks. That's ramial mulch, and it's a little bit hotter and a little bit probably higher nitrogen and just a different ratio of ingredients and foodstuffs in it as compared to the ground hardwoods, which we do also sometimes use. And the ground hardwood mulches, like the double ground mulches, are usually much bigger stumps and limbs, much more mature, that have been ground up or ground up several times. And then we already talked about a little bit the sawdust and shavings, and we do use quite a bit of the sawdust, quite a bit of the shavings, really, the bigger shavings in horse stalls and then actually by itself as mulch sometimes as well. So on the plus side with these bulk sort of wood mulches, it's pretty efficient to put them out using a UTV or utility vehicle or something like that, particularly if you've got a dump bed. It's really not too bad to do it with a wagon or with 5-gallon buckets. We've covered quite a bit of ground that way. And then these mulches tend to promote fungal growth in the soil because they are these wood products and sort of fungal foods. On the downside, they're not great at suppressing weeds. Thick hardwood mulch, will, but in general, we don't use these as intentionally as weed suppressors. nutrition from these mulches, is kind of slow release. It's going to take a little while for that wood material to be broken down by other living forms rather than your plants before it becomes available as foodstuffs for your plants. And then this stuff is often really expensive when it isn't free. So it's one of those places where you're going to look for the materials. Usually you're going to look for the materials, and if you can find them affordably, you're going to get them, and if not, you're going to use them really sparingly. As far as putting these kinds of bulk mulches down, we've touched on a little of this already, but really, it can feel overwhelming to see a massive pile of ramial mulch, 100 feet long and 10 feet high in your front yard, a quarter mile away from where it needs to go, and hundreds of UTV loads, to spread. So we found that really you just kind of get going. The best advice I can give is to find a way to get as much as possible in each load to the spot that's close to your final destination, and then from there just get moving. So these are the two primary methods that we use in these two pictures. The one, as I was talking about with the UTV, we've got a little chute that we've made just out of 2x10 material, two little triangular basically forms that we've made that get strapped down into the back of the UTV bed, and it just allows us to focus where that mulch goes. But even with that, it's pretty frantic pulling and dump a little more and go forward, hurry. It takes time to figure out how to do it. But once you do, Mom and I can cover some space, with this kind of setup really efficiently now. And then to the right, the picture to the right, you'll see, us using some other free labor that we occasionally farm to help tote four-wheeled dump bed wagon along the rows to take mulch down areas where the UTV won't go, or where for whatever reason we just don't want to drive the equipment. So how much coverage are you going to get out of wood mulches? Well, so again, as with hay, this is going to vary depending on how you're going to apply it and what your goals are. But a cubic yard, in general, might cover 200 square feet at a pretty reasonable thickness. But here's some examples of, how you might use these kinds of mulches. We often use this really thick sawdust, just straight wood shavings from a cabinet shop in the gutters between grow rows or on the uphill side of terrace grow rows, because this stuff does a really good job of holding moisture. Most annual weeds aren't going to germinate through this, and it packs down. You can walk on it without worrying about it compressing the soil underneath. There's a lot of benefits to it, but you're going to use a lot if you use it that way. And then on the other hand, if we're using like a ramial mulch somewhere and we're working with a living mulch in the long run, our goal is to actually intentionally grow living plants around our target plants. A really thin layer of that ramial mulch can do a really good job to seed in some fungal biology, provide a little soil cover for those plants to germinate, and then the living mulch will germinate through it over time. In this case, maybe 300 feet of grow row out of a cubic yard of this kind of material. See, there's a few questions have come in. I think we're about at a break spot anyway. Let's just see. We actually have a fair bit more that we can do. So let's just pause here. Let me just take a look at these questions and see if there's anything that's really useful. Yep, we'll come up on some poo here in a minute. So we'll talk plenty about poo and nitrogen sources. Specific soil microbes under microscope. Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit. Grass, hay, or do you use straw? So my understanding is straw is basically sort of like dried in the field and then cut, and it doesn't have the same foodstuffs in it. That's going to be a much slower to break down fungal food. And we have used straw some, but I'm talking about using hay. That is basically just whatever's growing in the pasture that has been cut, and still, when it's still alive, it's cut. So it's got a lot of that stuff that was up in the leaves still in it, even after it's dried. So that's what I was talking about there. And then manure quality. All right, we'll get to these other questions. So we'll just keep rolling because we're almost to where we're talking about the poo here in a second anyway. I included this slide. There's a ton here, and these slides will all be available both on our website and hopefully CFSA as well. And so you can look at all the details here. I just wanted to point out that, hay and wood mulch, the way we've used it has cost about, 8 to 16 cents per square foot over the last 3 years. And all the detailed numbers here are here for our area. This is just what we've paid. So that's something that we can talk about later in Q&A, or I'm happy to talk about. I just wanted to include it briefly here for people to get some sense of what it costs to use hay and wood mulches. So there's a couple other types of material that you can use, and we'll just quick and then be at a good check-in point. Leaves you can really use for mulch, and I would say that leaves sort of walk this line between being a mulch and a soil amendment because they do tend to break down pretty fast. You can get them as sort of pre-composted leaves, leaf mold they call it. I'm not sure if that's the right way to spell it, but and it's just a more digested form of leaves, as opposed to fresh dry leaves that you can just rake out of your woods or maybe obtain in other ways through the city or something like that. Be aware with leaves that some trees do produce allelopathic compounds, black walnut and other trees like that, and some of those compounds can end up in the leaves. So if you're using freshly fallen, cherry potentially, or walnut or other plants, just be aware that there are compounds in there that may suppress growth of other plants for a season or two. So on the plus side, leaves can be obtained for free. They do tend to favor fungal populations, and they do provide pretty quick plant available nutrition if you've got any activity in your soil. And on the downside, they do break down quickly, so you're not going to get some of those maintenance benefits. And I mentioned this before, but if you lay them down and they end up getting really matted for whatever reason, you can get anaerobic conditions and kind of these slime layers that are not beneficial for aerobic microbiology, which is what we want in our soil. And I've found leaves to be a little bit more cumbersome to spread, but maybe that's just me. Spent mushroom substrate we've talked about here for a minute, and we'll just touch really quickly on this again. But these are spent mushroom blocks that we get from my aunt and uncle's mushroom farm, is borrowed land mushroom farm. They operate out of a little corner of my parents' farm, RavenRidge. And so when they were growing a lot of mushrooms out, when they were actually fruiting a lot of mushrooms, we were getting a lot of blocks. So for a year there, we were putting probably 1,500 blocks, out several times a year, like this. And this is basically just, what's left is a fungus that's still alive, but sort of slowly dying because it's run out of food. And then the little bit of stuff that fungus couldn't break down. And if you get it out into your grow rows, man, it can start growing again, or at least provide food for other biology. And I feel like has been a really beneficial piece of the puzzle for us. And worms love it. So you can even just pile this all up and just make a nice worm bed if you just leave it for a couple of years. But let's move on, and we can come back to that if anybody has more interest in that specifically. So manures. You can mulch with manures. Not always the best option for a lot of reasons that may be obvious. So we have at the Hidden Springs farm, we have a nice barn which we have horses in occasionally, and so we bed the stalls with shavings and sometimes with hay, and then I collect that and pile it up and compost some of it and use some of it relatively fresh, depending on what it is. So generally, manure that's mixed with shavings is going to work really well breaking down into soil, mixed with other materials to break into soil, because it's just a finer kind of mix that tends to break down better. We found when it's mixed with hay, or it's really hay or straw heavy manure, it's not going to break down as fast. And so sometimes we'll use that as a mulch, particularly on an area where we know what we're growing next isn't going to be harvested before that manure is going to have broken down. Now, definitely using the right poo for the right purpose is important here. Goat, alpaca, sheep poo, these are small pellets that are going to persist for a long time. And so just be aware of that. Chicken and other, bird poos are really high nitrogen, a lot hotter, can burn plants and certainly young plants if they're put out too fresh. Horse manure, we already talked about, compost down really well if it's mixed with sawdust particularly, and will come quickly mixed with hay as well. And then hogs and cows, their poo is a little less, none of it's fun to deal with, but it's the least fun of the poos to deal with, in my opinion. So we tend to just put those animals out where we want them, right on the grow rows. And you can see one of our bred heifers here walking down the row where we've put hay down, and she's going to mix some poo into that and bring some biology into that equation. And then down on the bottom there, mom is feeding, spreading some seed in front of these hogs who are going to do some rooting for us on these terraces that were in the early stage of prep. So kind of wrapping up this sort of section, you don't have to pick just one of these materials. We use mix and match all over the place at this point. Again, these different materials provide different benefits, and if you have access to them, definitely mix and match them. Put the more inert stuff in your pathways, actively breaking down stuff on your grow beds, layer them on top of each other, and then start looking at what's happening, and you'll find out what you'd like to do pretty quickly. I do want to hit these last two slides real quick, and then we'll maybe touch in on what we need to do after that. So the transition to living mulches is something that's in progress at RavenRidge. These pictures are actually from 2 years ago, where I pushed really hard on growing our hemp directly in cover crop or living mulch, and we had success, but there's a lot to learn this year. I kind of changed our arrangement and tried a few specific things instead of just shotgunning everything, and narrow down a little more what we feel like is going to work well. A couple more years, and I think we'll have a pretty good handle on how to do this for our system. And I'll be excited to present more about it in the future. But I wanted to just kind of let people see what I'm talking about here. On the left, we planted buckwheat and mustards. Buckwheat just has a fast cycle, but it also brings in a lot of these beneficial critters that we really want in our systems. They can be allelopathic, and we did see some stunting in our hemp, but I think a planting timing could change that. And in fact, this year we timed our planting where the buckwheat seed went down a little bit later after the hemp had gotten established, and didn't see the same problems. In the middle there is spring oats seeded down the middle where the hemp actually is going to go, and then buckwheat and clover on the sides, which stayed as kind of a perennial cover. And man, that was a beautiful grow row. It worked so well. And I will definitely continue doing that, where you plant something that's a little easier to terminate and work with on the inside, and out on the outside on the edges, you plant these things that are a little bit more persistent and maybe harder to deal with as competition to your plants. And then on the right, that's just a oats and clover mix. I think there's crimson and some yellow clover, and that might be some ranunculus in there, which there's no more of this year. And nor is there any more of that broom straw in our third year. How about that? So me growing productive production crops in these living cover systems is the future of regenerative agriculture, because that's where regenerative system is in these cycles that only happen when plants are photosynthesizing and engaging with the microbiology in the soil in positive ways. So this is where we'll definitely continue to really push. We'll still use the organic mulches just because you have to, I think, in these systems, but our goal is to move towards this living mulch down the road. Okay, so I see that we've got just 4 minutes here, and I can look through the rest of these questions, and we can go there. I've got quite a few more slides on tips and tricks that we can look through. And maybe we just need to figure out how the best way to proceed through that is. I am looking at these questions and seeing about herbicide-free round or square bales. Yep, they can be tricky to find, the herbicide-free bales. And they don't necessarily have to be herbicide-free from the perspective of the user, the grower not using herbicides, because the herbicides do pass through those systems. So they don't persist for years and years in most growing systems. I'm encouraging you to use them either way. I'm just saying that sometimes you got no choice but to find the person who sprayed the longest ago and use that hay. And I can tell you from experience that having used hay like that, we haven't had problems in our experience with using hay that I know had been sprayed 2 seasons ago. So that's kind of where we are, unfortunately. And then regarding manure quality, how do you handle parasite management for your animals and the effects of dewormers on soil life? Yeah, so that, not directly related to mulching, but just really quickly, the dewormers, have really high effects at specific times of the season, and most of the dewormers from the manure in a certain amount of time. And so I think that's information that I would refer you to other folks for the details of, but I can say that there are lots of ways to handle deworming. For us, we almost never deworm because we rotate really well. And in the future, we'll ever have to deworm because we rotate really well. But it takes time to get enough land of enough quality that you can rotate enough that you don't end up with parasite problems. So as far as in mulches that you use, yeah, we never use dewormers in the animals. So if an animal has been dewormed in one of our stalls, we're not going to use the stuff that we collect for the appropriate amount of time from those animals in our mulches. We'll just put it in a separate pile and spread it out somewhere where it'll help the soil over time. And we're not worried if it has a little bit of a negative impact in that particular space. How can you make sure animal waste doesn't contain glycophosphates? Yeah, I think you pretty much just have to have it tested or manage the animals yourself so that the land they're eating on doesn't have those residues. But you can do tests of pretty much any material, soil, plant, whatever, for these residues. They're expensive, but if you really want to know, that's pretty much the only way you can really know, apart from knowing what your management practices are on your land. All right, well, I think we can probably keep moving for a few minutes here, and then I know that Mariana will come back in a minute, and we'll see what we need to do next. But so a couple of just quick tips. If you're new to mulching, start small. Pick a small space, see how it works. There's a lot to learn about managing this way. Take the time to think through staging. Actually planning out, literally sitting in the space where you're going to do something and planning out, okay, here's where I'm going to drive in, here's where I'm going to dump that, here's where I'm going to drive the tractor or my wheelbarrow, or where I'm going to walk. Here's where I'm going to put the piles so that they're staged where I can get them where I need them to go. A lot of people don't like doing that. I do like it. I think it helps me avoid compaction. It helps me avoid driving more than I need to. It helps me avoid a lot of times the hardest work. About half the time when I sit down and actually think about what I'm going to do, I realize I don't need to do half of what I thought I needed to do. And man, those are good, good thinking sessions. Sometimes it doesn't really come to that and you don't solve any problems, but I would encourage you to take the time to think it through before you get the round bales, on the tractor driving out into the field. I did mention that we would talk a little bit more about the round bale unroller, and I will just quickly say ours is just galvanized pipe with T's that are threaded. Basically, it's a rectangle of pipe, 4 pipes, and one of them you can pull out through the T and slide through the middle of the round bale. And the other side of this square you attach to the back of whatever your vehicle is. Ours is that little UTV that you saw in the picture. And basically you just slide it through the middle, hook it on, and then you start driving after you've cut the strings, and it just unrolls it as you go. Somebody still has to walk behind, but it stops you from worrying about it getting away from you. And these big bales, the main things are to think about: unrolling on contour, consider the direction you're going to have to unroll something, because once you plop it down on a hill, particularly if you have to flip it over to get it to actually unroll, that can be kind of a pain. So try and think it through. And then we always try and use 2 people to unroll a hay bale on a hill, and just let it go if it gets away from you. It'll stop eventually. Hello.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It looks like we have a few more questions that have come in.
We'll get you to that slide that has sort of the details there of, that's where the presentation's posted, so feel free to click on it. And there are also other email addresses there if you have any other follow-up questions. So let's see, if there's a really short living cover you might recommend for standard market beds under peppers. Yeah, sure. So I mean, buckwheat is pretty low, and I found it to be really effective, again, if you seed it after your other plants are established. Some of the lower clovers, the yellow clovers, are really nice, but they're typically perennial, and so if you don't get them seeded in the fall before, you may or may not get a lot of benefit from them in the first year, in my experience. Crimson clover stays pretty low. I mean, it'll get a foot high, but under peppers, we do it. And we just go in occasionally and smush them down to the side directly around the plant where they're starting to create, too much tight space, and just smush them or break them. I mean, clovers in particular are really responsive to that and will in fact pump more nitrogen into the soil as a result of that kind of management activity. And then the other question is suggestion chemical-free hay. Yeah, so somebody who actually contracts with the grower to not spray, which is awesome. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah. That's all the questions I see, unless I missed one, and maybe I did, but I think that's all of them.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you so much again, Nathan, and thank you all for being here with us. As Nathan said, we'll have this presentation available for rewatch and download, so we really appreciate it. And a last thank you to our session sponsor, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Have a great day, y'all.
Awesome.